Sport Business. Global Sports Intelligence.
Hello and welcome to the Sport Business Podcast. This week we are going to dive into the newsroom with the latest developments in the industry of sport, including some mixed financial results for TKO and all their entities, a production deal for IMG and WTA, Paramount Plus's latest financial results as they eye more sports rights, and we'll also look at the latest on everything FIFA. Inside the deal, we will be joined by Matt Williams from Sport Business Sponsorship to talk us through the decision by Temporal, a business-to-business platform ostensibly becoming more B2C in their shirt sponsorship deal with Crystal Palace. Plus, we will have a full post-mortem from myself on the Glasgow 2026 Commonwealth Games. What were the metrics of success, plus the usual any other business. I'm joined, as usual, by John Rest. Jonathan, how are you doing? You had a day off on Monday. Was that to get match fit for the new season? How are you shaping up?
I did have a rare day off here. It was my son's 10th birthday. Somehow I have a 10-year-old, which is frightening, Martin. Known each other for many years.
Yeah, I still haven't met him. What I want to know is, did he watch any 10 minutes of World Cup on YouTube?
No, I don't think he did. I think he just stuck to the traditional broadcast. He's old school like that.
Good lad.
So, no. He watches plenty of YouTube, but I think the World Cup was consumed entirely on BBC and ITV, I believe.
Excellent.
As it should be.
Yes, very much so. And what have you been up to otherwise? Or is it just full-on work? Is your head just abuzz with work stories?
Yeah, it is a little bit. We're into the short football pre-season. I tried to watch the Arsenal game the other day, paid for a stream of their friendly against Girona. I think we've had this conversation before about clubs doing these. Just didn't work. It crashed. So they put the second half, I think, on YouTube, and they've got a game. Again, we record this on a Wednesday. They've got another friendly tonight, and they decided they're not going to show it on the Arsenal streaming platform because it doesn't work. So lots of disgruntled fans who have paid their like a pre-season package and are waiting to get a refund. So
it doesn't work in your case. I'm sure there was lots of successful streams.
I'm sure there was, yes.
Excellent. I hope you didn't watch. Did you watch any of the SPFL openers? To be fair, I have been critical in the past, and I know the reason for this is just because Sky does not have EFL and Premier League to show at the moment, but for the first time they showed all 6 opening Scottish Premiership matches. So fair play to them. It was well received.
Excellent.
And they put a good amount of editorial behind it as well and decent on social. So let's keep that up throughout the whole season. Would be nice. Let's go straight into it. I mean, we're not going to go massive on FIFA because this story is just evolving so quickly that us recording on Wednesday, publishing on Thursday, and some people listening on Friday or beyond, things will have overrun. But you... Interested in your thoughts, just top level thoughts, John, sort of week and a bit on. And we've had access to the 25-pager that was sent out to member associations. Not the one, I presume there must have been a different one to prospective investors because it was not detailed. It was PowerPoint ahoy.
Yeah, it wasn't. There was hardly anything in it.
Yeah, it was a pamphlet, really.
It was a pamphlet, yeah, shiny slides and some tables to show how, I think, under-monetized FIFA feels the World Cup is, or in terms of the fan, the spend per fan on a FIFA World Cup compared to, say, the NFL or any of the other major sports properties. I think that's where that was the only interesting nugget for us. It was low on financial detail, so clearly this is not the one that got investors excited because there was nothing in it to do so. It was very much, grow the sport together, and this is where we're short. But yeah, not anything to cause controversy, that pamphlet anyway.
The bit that kind of gets me, I suppose, is a lot of great, obviously, stories in the UK press about this, but it's also being written up now as a fait accompli. He is toast. You will see that everywhere, almost in a kind of football manager type way, and because the journalists want to, and you can understand why, to be toast. Many at FIFA want him to be toast. But I think general mistake being made, I think by some, is that they're taking the UEFA block of 55, the AFC block of 47, and adding those up and saying, well, those blocks are going to vote against him for a different candidate should we come to an election. Whereas, you've already seen Qatar, obviously, Saudi, Bhutan, Sri Lanka, I'm sure there's some others, being reposted by Gianni on his Insta. Are all 55 UEFA members going to vote for it when, the financial wins for the likes of San Marino? I don't know. So to get to 106, I think it's a little bit closer than maybe people want to believe, albeit the sound bites coming out internally now are so damning that it's really just the ardent backers that maybe stay behind him. But I just feel it's much, much closer than some would think if he holds on.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, we've still got 9 months until an election. So there's plenty of time I don't think this will die down though. But even if he does get re-elected, it's like a government, isn't it? If you only get re-elected with a tiny majority, what's going to happen if you're trying to get, your decisions through and there's this much revolt in world football? I think what is quite damning is that we've seen senior people within FIFA. I'm not talking about FA presidents around the world. I'm talking about people that report into him, essentially, coming out publicly against the proposals, i.e. against him. This was a one-man band, if you like, leading this. And, we've had the Secretary General eventually kind of come out. We had the Chief Operating Officer, Kevin Lamore. That broke, I think, at the end of last week. Associated Press
AP,
got an interview on the record with him.
Great quote,
which was incredible. Yeah, absolutely. So I think he's lost the dressing room, if you like, which is not a good sign. Does he care? I don't know. He's probably got his own dressing room, so he doesn't really mind. But I think, as you say, there are plenty of countries that are coming out in support. They're not exactly football powerhouses, perhaps commercially they are, though.
Lots of white pumps in that dressing room. The bit that really interests me, and I know we're not going to labour the point, but just I think on a human level, I find it really interesting. And also the bit that people are so surprised that he had this plan when, if you look back at the track record, we touched on this last week, but the $25 billion SoftBank, in inverted commas, backed Club World Cup proposal, was it 8 years ago? And then that kind of unraveled as to where that money was. $4 billion Club World Cup, which you got to less than half through obviously the zone agreement, etc. Selling off FIFA Plus for billions. FIFA Plus, which was essentially what used to be My Kuchu, sort of long tail stuff with more rights now. Selling that off for billions, which eventually wasn't in that way. The African Super League, $250 million a year, and of course the really aggressive commercial line he's taken on licensing or EA Sports, walking away from that deal because of the big asking price that was there. And it's just, the pattern has been there, but also a pattern of kind of slightly worrying behaviour in that the inability to read the room, the desire to have, according to the reports, announced this at the end of the World Cup astonishes me and smacks of somebody in a position of power, surrounded by a small group of people he trusts, clearly, excited by the power, dislike of the press, so much so that you're not doing press conferences, you're doing a 45-minute monologue in a press conference, you're putting out Trumpian-style statements about, the press lying. And all of that creates a bubble. And the inability to read the room in this case, I think, is potentially going to be his downfall. It is truly astonishing that the bubble that he's kind of let, and in many respects, commercially, successful bubble that they've generated in some ways, for sure, but just wildly astonishing. I don't know if he takes, PR advice from whom. I have no idea, but intrigues me a lot that you can get to that stage. For somebody who, we would bump into him back in the UEFA days, amiable guy, can hold a room, but yeah.
Yeah, talk about people that can't read a room or entities that can't read a room. JP Morgan. I mean, what's it? 2 for 2 now, right? They had the European Super League. Which one lasted longer? Is it this? I'm trying to work out which one died first.
It depends if
quicker.
You count the Spanish teams that held on, I suppose. But...
Well, exactly. But yeah, they can't read a room either. So I think some kind of good reporting needs to go into their processes as well in this. But we could talk about this for a long time. And I'm sure inundated every day with different FAs coming out with a statement. I'm sure this is going to draw to some kind of head in the next few weeks or so, you'd think.
Yeah. Well, let's keep things Trumpian. Tell me about the White House. Tell me about the UFC event there and the losses, but a much bigger picture for TKO. We've talked about On Location before in terms of a flavour of where the World Cup hospitality was going. We got a bit more detail on that this week. Give us the lowdown.
Yeah, TKO reported their second quarter finances revenue across the group up 18% to just over $1.5 billion. Huge number, successful quarter for them. Obviously, UFC and WWE are the main drivers of this. Revenue up across the board. UFC, I think, was the fastest growth of their segments, 29% revenue up, driven largely by that Paramount deal that kicked in January that we talked about before, 7.7 billion over 7 years. There was a interesting little nugget. It got a lot of coverage, as it kind of would for the nature of it, but actually the number's been out there for a while. They basically had to absorb 30 million in costs for staging this event on the lawn of the White House.
Is that the damage to the lawn?
Yeah, well,
how much damage have they done to the lawn?
I did see a picture on Getty. My lawn looks pretty bad, but it looks like it's had a UFC fight on it. But yeah, this was something that they kind of, were expecting it as anticipated. I think the CFO called it. Dana White.
Could they not have cut up bits of the lawn and sold it off?
Oh, well, yeah, quite possibly. Maybe Trump hadn't thought of that one.
It's part of
Johnny
it.
can tell him. So yeah, WE revenue up again, media rights, new media rights deals helping their big events. But the on-location stuff, I think, was super interesting. The numbers we don't know the exact nature of that FIFA deal, I guess, in terms of how the revenues are split. There were some big numbers pushed out in the earnings call. I think Mark Shapiro, COO of TKO, said that there were 568,000 hospitality packages at the World Cup sold through the second quarter. Now, that doesn't account for the 25 games that were played in July. And obviously, as the tournament progressed, they were, bigger fixtures. So they won't be.
I don't recognise those matches, John.
Yeah, it does actually say, the Scotland World Cup, they call it, to the end of June.
Indeed.
So he said demand was, strong. And interesting with the LA Olympics on the horizon, another on-location or in the on-location portfolio. He kind of said this is becoming almost like the norm now, this experiential program and hospitality that people want, front of line access, I think he called it. So I think that was quite interesting. Again, numbers not hugely available unless you are a proper accounting nerd, but it said that they got a favourable impact of 22 million of net collections related to on location. So yeah, huge. When you consider what the struggles that they had around the Paris Olympics, which we've documented before, this World Cup has been a big hospitality success, I think.
Yeah, and they needed it, and certainly the mood music has changed in these calls around write-downs for Paris versus now what's happening with the World Cup, and I think they're pretty bullish about LA. Just to keep things on TKO, briefly announced today, which is Wednesday, but this week the IMG's got quite a high-profile production contract with WTA, which is interesting. They've been appointed managed production services partner from 2027 onwards, long-term deal. DAZN handled production for part of WTA Media, but the long-term deal that comes to the end of this year, I think. So yeah, they've been talking about some various innovation as they would. An important win for IMG and the kind of studios business after loss of Premier League productions. There's quite a few high-profile clients that they have on the production side still, despite that loss. And also interesting that the WTA has gone off and done this ostensibly standalone deal with IMG when one of the points of discussion with the commercial ATP merger, now looking increasingly unlikely to happen, was the complexities of how you could sort of maybe do some kind of singular production. IMG already works with ATP Media, obviously. No suggestion of that in the release as to any crossover with the ATP, and appears that WTA is getting on with its business. So interesting timing on that.
Yeah, that commercial merger has been talked about and seemingly been dead for some time, right? There was obviously too many I's to dot and T's to cross to get that over the line.
Yeah, I suppose the distribution of monies plus new leadership coming in at both entities has complicated things. So we will see on that, but certainly carrying on a new business. And just finally on newsroom stuff, John, quickly on Joe wrote a piece this morning on not just Paramount's financials, but maybe how they see sports rights acquisitions, obviously with a big UFC deal in the US, etc. Yeah,
you spoke a minute ago about how Shapiro and TKO were bullish. Well, I think Paramount were. Can you out-bullish someone? But David Ellison, chairman and CEO, speaking on the second quarter earnings call yesterday, I mean, as I mentioned, they'd splashed out $7.7 billion on UFC, $1.1 billion a year. And he said that's already paying dividends from the first 6 months of the coverage that's on Paramount Plus. So as we know, they've got rid of the pay-per-view, which was, how major combat sports, mixed martial arts was always seen in terms of pay-per-view buys. They got rid of that. It's all on Paramount Plus. He's saying they've kind of beaten records consistently throughout the year, reference the fight on the White House lawn. And they are kind of getting value for money. And he said it's given them the confidence, if you want, to continue as a buyer of sports rights. So I think if you are a big property out there and you've got your rights coming to market, expect Paramount to be aggressive. We've seen them do that in the Champions League sales across Europe and even parts of the Americas. So yeah, that was bullish point number one. And then bullish point number two, highly confident was his quote of acquiring Warner Brothers Discovery. Now, obviously, people that have been reading our stuff over the last couple of weeks will know that that takeover has now been delayed due to a legal challenge in 12 US states. They were hoping, we'd heard over the last couple of months or few months, that they were hoping to get that done in Q3 this year, but that's not going to happen now until around June next year. And that is costly, actually. I mean, you did a piece that you recently, Martin, on the ticking fee. It's 25 cents per WBD share every day after September the 30th that this deal is not completed. So that could amount to $650 million per quarter, which is just adding. I mean, I guess when you're dropping $110 billion, it's small change, but still, you can see why they wanted to get this done. The promises made to shareholders that this would get done and there wouldn't be any regulatory hurdles might come back and bite them to the tune of quite a lot of money.
I think if I was a member of the Ellison family, I'd be pretty bullish. I'd wake up every day feeling very bullish. The fight on the White House lawn makes it sound like...
I should clarify which fight that was. Yeah, there might
wasn't just the Donald having a fight with that big bunny he brings out at Easter, having a wrestle. Excellent. On that slightly less serious point, we'll maybe wrap up on this section. We will be back very shortly with Matt Williams, who's going to take a deep dive and an eagle-eye look, John, do you like it, on a Crystal Palace sponsorship.
From private equity to global media and US college sports, unlock the most trusted data and insights in our reports. Explore more at sportbusiness.com.
Welcome back to the Sport Business Podcast. For Inside the Deal, we're joined by Matthew Williams of Sport Business Sponsorship. Matthew, Premier League season is only a couple of weeks away. Crystal Palace have controversially launched a home shirt, which looks remarkably like an away shirt, but that's not the right podcast for this. However, they have a new shirt, front of shirt sponsor, an US software infrastructure company called Temporal. I've never heard of them. I'm reading that off of your story. Start off, tell us why a B2B company is engaging with a Premier League shirt deal.
Yeah, it's not the type of brand your brain goes straight to when you think of typical Premier League front of shirt sponsors. You think of B2C brands, right? Obviously heavily dominated by the gambling category over recent years. But as we covered on previous podcasts, that's not an option now for clubs. And so I guess it's no surprise that we've started to see some different types of deals done. Yeah, no more so than Temporal. It's interesting, though, the reason that they're interested in it, despite definitely a business platform is B2B, their business funnel works a little differently to maybe some other B2B technology brands where they see a lot of their new business starting at the developer level and then funneling up to, a decision maker, CFO, whatever it may be. So the people they're actually trying to reach to kind of start that new business chain are the software developers that would be interested in using their products. And therefore, obviously, the software developers you actually, to reach them, want to make a more B2C type play. That's what they see as being the most effective platform to reach them. And they'd certainly already had some success doing that in North America. And now they've decided to go international with the Premier League front of shirt deal with Crystal Palace.
Yeah. Are there any examples of how they're using, you mentioned the US there briefly, how they're using sponsorship to connect with that developer group more directly?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, obviously we don't need to kind of illustrate or explain the visibility and the reach that a Premier League front of shirt sponsorship gives you. We don't need to go into full detail on that, but it's worth mentioning that it's obviously huge, and they see huge benefit from that at kind of all levels, not just the developer level, all levels of their sort of business funnel. But in terms of that developer point that I mentioned at the start in the first answer, they've actually been quite, I would say, creative in the early days of the activation of this partnership. The CMO of Temporal, Clair Byrd, has actually hosted a Ask Me Anything on Reddit, which I don't know if you're familiar with, but I guess the clue's kind of in the title. But they see Reddit as an interesting platform for them. they see it as sort of highly targeted platform for them because there's a strong correlation between heavy use of Reddit and being a software engineer. Not to kind of reinforce any stereotypes, but that was what we were told by the company in our analysis pieces on this deal and Temporal's activity. And yeah, Clair Byrd actually told us that the early activity, that Reddit Ask Me Anything was directly related to the Crystal Palace sponsorship. The early activity, and we're only obviously, very early stages, probably a month into the actual deal starting, but the quote was that it's drawn technologists out of the woodwork all over the world, most of them outside the UK. And, as I say, she's talking specifically Crystal Palace there. Maybe some people, I'd obviously think of sort of a South London community club in terms of Crystal Palace's kind of typical values, but that just proves how far, I guess, the reach of a Premier League shirt deal can go, whoever it may be with.
I was just checking out the home kit. I hadn't seen it. That is quite controversial. I also like the logo. It reminds me of the Springfield Atoms, which is the American football team in The Simpsons. I don't know if they've designed it on that. I also like that you asked us if we were aware of Reddit as if you were talking to your grandparents, but I appreciate that. But on a more serious note, betting brand out, non-betting brand in, that can sometimes lead to some hurt for a Premier League club financially. Can you give us a flavour maybe of what this means for Crystal Palace in commercial terms?
Yeah, there's one important point to note in answering that question, which is that Crystal Palace's previous front of shirt sponsor, gambling brand Net88, also held the training kit rights. So two kind of high-level assets bundled together. So crucially, this deal with Temporal does not include training kit rights. So it leaves them with an asset to sell there. So the previous deal with Net88, we understood it to be worth in the region of 12 million per year, with 10 million of that allocated to the front of shirt and 2 million for the training kit. Now, if you want precise specifics on the Temporal, the valuation of the deal with Crystal Palace, you'll have to go to Sport Business Sponsorship. We'll obviously the links to the relevant pieces in the notes section of this podcast. But yeah, we understand I'll share that it's a slight decrease in terms of the front of shirt rights specifically, which I obviously said was 10 with Net88. However, the fact that the training kit rights aren't bundled is significant. The opportunity there now is that clubs can ultimately kind of leverage the lucrative gambling sector for assets like training kit, because the ban, as we know, only applies to the front of shirt. So we've seen one of the biggest clubs in the league, Manchester United, do that in the last couple of days in a really sort of high profile, high value deal with Betway. And so we expect to see more clubs do training kit betting sponsorship deals that also sleeve, and both those assets are open at Crystal Palace. So what we could see if they were to sign a gambling brand on the training kit, theoretically, the value combined of the front of shirt and training kit assets could be similar to what they're earning through Net88, or at least very close, maybe even more if they can leverage it off, obviously, Crystal Palace Europa League club this year. So you kind of, I guess their ambition shouldn't be limited in that sense.
Yeah, it certainly seems like the training kit, maybe they just become more prevalent because of the amount of content clubs are putting on social media. But it does feel like, obviously we know the Betway deal is a big one, and there's a number out there that I assume one side has briefed, certainly saying it's the biggest in that category. But it does feel like that is where clubs can make, some of these perhaps smaller clubs, not your major commercial powerhouses in the Premier League, can pick up a little bit of extra commercial revenue, right?
That's right. I think you're right about it becoming more prominent because of club in-house content around training. I think also the fact that it's typically these deals apply to not just sort of training kit one on the training ground, but you're also talking about pre-match warm-up kit. And obviously you see the pre-match warm-up covered probably, I would say, more frequently than ever visually as part of broadcast these days. You'll typically have, I don't know, if you're watching in the UK on Sky Sports, Gary Neville, Jamie Carragher chatting about the game ahead with shots of players in the pre-match warm-up in the background. And that can be actually quite sort of significant visibility. So brands and clubs have, obviously will notice trends like that in broadcast and adjust their opportunities and spend accordingly.
I was just having a look back. They've had a lot of betting brands, Crystal Palace. They really have been sort of relied on them for a while. I was going to quiz you both on who's the oldest or the furthest back shirt sponsor of Palace you can remember. And I know you're at a disadvantage here, Matt.
So
goodness me. I'll let John go first.
I actually not even sure I can name a Crystal Palace sponsor from that far ago. I mean, they had Virgin. Was it the airline Virgin?
Yes, Virgin.
Ian
Virgin
Wright
1990.
days?
They were Yeah, they used
I
to
was trying
advertise.
to picture like footage of Ian Wright scoring goals for Crystal
Yeah.
Palace and whether he had a brand on the front of his shirt.
I think Virgin started flying to LA so that they advertised that, and TDK, Electronics, was on the other one. Red Rose
Well,
apparently was the
I
first ever
imagine
one.
that-
Never heard of them.
Bringing it back to kind of a serious point, I imagine Virgin's interest might have been sort of London-based, airport-based.
Yeah, I think it was New Air Route.
We probably should just mention about Temporal that they have a London interest too. They've hired quite a few people in London this year, and that is also a factor in why Crystal Palace as well. So bringing it back, you can see even right back to the days of Virgin and now, Palace and other London clubs have that sort of
pull.
unique selling point to leverage.
And what does broader picture, is there anything left? I mean, we're a couple of weeks away. Anything left front of shirt wise? If you're a big brand wanting to come in, who can you
I
sponsor?
saw Sunderland did their kit launch in Times Square, wasn't it, or something? And it's a beautiful kit, like proper old school, and no shirt branding. So obviously they're still hunting around, or they just haven't stuck it on.
Yeah, so
ironed it on.
Sunderland are one of 3 that's available if you're a brand wanting a shirt package in the Premier League this year. Yeah, Sunderland, Nottingham Forest and Chelsea. Now, Sunderland and Forest are in the category of wanting to replace a gambling brand. They were both leveraging that gambling sector that we always talk about for front of shirt sponsorship last year. Chelsea are a bit different. They seem to have just given up on the idea of front of shirt sponsorship for about 3 years. No, that is a joke in case anyone from Chelsea is listening. Obviously, what's tended to happen is they've signed short-term deals towards the end of the season after holding out and not engaging in a deal at the start of the season. Because, as we understand it, and as I guess is kind of obvious, they're sort of holding firm on their valuation. And as it stands, we're into August now. And again, it looks like no shirt sponsor for Chelsea. It was conspicuous by its absence again in the signing announcements for the likes of Jordan Henderson and Danny Welbeck as they build their sort of dad's army team for this year.
I mean, as you mentioned Forest, it's funny, all of the kind of complexities that go around activation, negotiation, motivation behind deals, and Idea Gen, or the sleeve sponsor of Forest, that deal really came about as a passion project. I think the CEO, he's a huge Forest fan. So that still happens. That used to happen a lot in football. So I don't know, maybe one of the remaining 3, a big fan, can come out and put their brand behind it.
Thank you very much for that, Matthew, telling us about Palace and a new brand, Temporal, that could be coming your way soon if you are a sports rights holder. We will have you back on the podcast very soon. We will take a quick break and be back with the final part of the Sport Business Podcast.
Stay ahead in the business of sport with trusted news, data and analysis across media rights, sponsorship and more. Explore our subscription options at sportbusiness.com.
Welcome back to the third and final part of the Sport Business Podcast. We're going to mix it up slightly this week, Martin. Maybe we'll save a few jokes for the end, if they are jokes. But I want to put the Commonwealth Games to bed. We've covered it in depth. You have been there, obviously, on the ground speaking to people. It's finished now, so good time to kind of wrap it up. And you sit down with Phil Batty, CEO of the local organising committee this week. Can you give a little bit of insight into what you two had a chat about?
Yes, John, let's do some big takeaways from Glasgow 2026. And we do like a big takeaway in Glasgow. There's your first joke.
A Morrison's takeaway, as of last week.
Exactly. Listen, bigger picture, the delivery of this was a huge success, full stop. We don't need to go in the background of why this event took place and where it was meant to be in Australia and stuff and everything. But in terms of the athletes being happy, in terms of the transport, in terms of event flow, like it was, like clockwork, the music, people in and out of venues. There is a very slick organising team in Scotland from Glasgow Life, SEC, Trivandi were an event partner, were built into the organising committee, even this venue overlay, a company called ES Global. So that whole kind of relationship between all of them guaranteed what was an impressive event to be at, even though you're talking an 18-month window to contract, to put in everything in place, to put the look and feel in place. Yeah, it was 4 cluster venues, only one of which was outside. There's no road race, there's no marathon, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah, athletes were happy. And I even think, just the games happening is a success looking ahead to Amdavad 2030 and saving the games. I'm going to continue just for a moment on the very positive stuff, John, but I know you want some negatives. But
Always.
yeah, I mean, that legacy of the Commonwealth sport in terms of the 60% reduction in budget, we wrote about that this week. No athletes village, busing athletes around, which they all bought into, lower length of stay for athletes, just all to cut the cost down. All kind of worked. I think the games needed some stardust. There were some international stars not there. It got that, and it got some moments in the last weekend. Jamaica, Australia in the netball, sold out audience, Josh Kerr, Minute Mile, Emma Finucane, track cycling. So yeah, we had these kind of moments at packed arenas, which the games needed, I think, to finish off with. Host broadcast was also actually a success. We've talked about that before, but to my non-expert eye maybe, but it felt, albeit the budget was dramatically reduced for actual sports deal, was actually decent.
I want to touch on the budget then, Martin. Where did they, or do we know where they kind of ended up? Because we've talked about it. I did a piece on the money previewing it. We know the budget was substantially smaller than any other Commonwealth Games we can remember, but did they stick to it?
Yeah, hugely smaller, 600 million smaller than Birmingham is the kind of figure that they come out with. Yeah, so it was 150 million was the initial one. The privately funded spend in the end, 162.6 million. The jump up was described to me today by Phil as, he said, the ticketing and merch revenue had grossed up, and there's been changes around cost of sales and VAT, and they decided to invest in sort of sports presentation, look and feel, and the live site. So he insisted that there'd be no cost overrun on the games, and that the spend was partly related to raised commercial revenues, which we will come to in a second, actually. But yeah, that's where we were. Of course, there's 100 million from Commonwealth Sport, which is the money from Victoria compensation, 2.3 million from Commonwealth Games Australia, and then there's a tiny bit of money flows in from the council, city council and government on the festivals. That starts to give you an idea of the commercial revenue target.
Martin, just another thing I've covered, we both covered multi-sport games before Olympics, Commonwealths, and you go along to the daily press conference, and the first question is 9 times out of 10, what's the latest on ticket sales? How many people were queuing? How are they developing? What was the overall outcome on ticketing? It's always a point of contention at any games, whether there's empty seats or people can't access the right ticketing. What was the general vibe?
So the big figure at the closing press conference was 434,000 ticketed spectators, of close to 500,000 was made available. Now, that figure then got run in the press as, they've sold 434,000 tickets to the public. That's not the case. This is a sort of catch-all phrase that event organisers use. Birmingham used it. So of that, yes, you've got tickets sold at full price to the public. You've got tickets sold at reduced price. They were sold at £10 for netball, some of them, or bowls, or even £8 if you use your discount code. The Tartan Army, as we know, we've spoken about, the members getting up to 4 tickets each, free ones, national governing bodies, free tickets. There was all sorts of, sort of staff being told there's 4 tickets to the weightlifting. Do you want to go? Or Trivandi, sort of send an email saying, do you want to go? Because that's available. Athletics, they made the decision, I think there's 500 seats during the biblical rain they had. They told them, come back to the next morning session free. So all of that, all of the kind of giveaways, plus also tickets that are bought and purchased by sponsors as their allocation. We don't have a number for that. I did look at Birmingham. Now, Phil said that particular element was not a particularly material number when you take into account 434,000. At Birmingham, they had a figure for distribution of tickets to key clients. Now, they don't specify if key clients are sponsors and others, but tickets, not accreditations, of just under 47,000. So trying to piece together all of that is difficult. I asked him on record how many tickets they'd sold to the public, which he didn't want to say. He said that was because, they were still essentially counting them up and going through Ticketmaster and all the rest of it. But trying to get a real hold on how many tickets were sold and how many were sold at full price is really difficult. The organising committee insists that they had 2 aims. Did the venues feel like they had the right number of spectators in them? Yes, they say. And did they hit the revenue goal? Yes, they say. But it was a huge bone of contention at the games. Even some of the athletic sessions during the week, morning sessions typically don't sell out. There was one evening session I think I was at which didn't appear to be sold out. The real tricky one, bowls, bowls seemed happy enough with the venue, actually, to be fair, but it was a real struggle. It was just dead, the bowls.
You do surprise me.
Yes, like some of the viewers.
and some of the athletes as well.
Well, yes. So they were talking about whether they, if they did it again, could they just get rolling tickets that you come into the bowls for an hour and give a contribution? Because it's a 7-hour session. So that was tough. But yeah, I feel like we've unpacked maybe the actual number of tickets sold to the public a little bit. That fits in obviously to this sum that we're talking about on commercial revenue. And have they made it, which they say that they've met their commercial goals. When I start to unpack broadcast, which at Birmingham, I think broadcast rights revenue was in the region of, around 20 to 25 million pounds for everything. This time around, you didn't. You have a BBC deal, which is upwards of 10 million pounds. So they've taken a big hit in the UK market. As you know, you've got Australia, you've got New Zealand, Canada, which is a very low 6-figure sum. I see that as really tough, that sales process, and sponsorship even more so. They admit that they had a challenge getting to where they wanted to on sponsorship, and they admit that ticketing and merchandising did a lot of the work on the games in terms of that kind of heavy lifting. Sponsorship, low lead-in time, World Cup going on, hard to get brands to buy in. It was tough. I understand that we're talking about a kind of mid-7-figure number, certainly when the games began. Now, there were some late deals. Amul came in, Indian dairy brand for boxing and stuff, so whether that's been topped up a little bit. But really, really tough. So, ticketing and merchandising, and just to give you a final bit of detail maybe on these revenue streams so you understand what the usual mix is. Glasgow 2014, much, much bigger, many, many more sports, clearly. 118 million overall commercial pie, of which 43.6 million sponsorship, 33 million broadcast, 33 million ticketing, merch is 1.8. So if you're looking at merch and ticketing to do that degree of heavy lifting, to be honest, I struggle with it, but they're not a public company. They don't have to, divulge a breakdown of everything, and they insist that the commercial revenue targets have been met or even exceeded. I just can't in my head, having, understand what I understand and having been there and getting a sense of it, I just can't square it off, I must say, but that's what they said.
So given that the financing of these games is very different to previous ones in terms of where the money's coming from, what is the likelihood that we'll get a deep dive report in 6 months' time into how these games were a success or not, the economic impact that we often see? Is that going to come down the line or not?
Yes, a post-mortem. We should have done a post-mortem at the Royal College of Pathologists.
Yeah, well, we'll go back and do a live one there. That would be fun.
Oh, it's a live one. No, not so live. Will the numbers come out? I mean, now this is another interesting area. They don't actually have to do an evaluation report because they are not funded by government money. I don't believe there's anything in the sort of hosting funding agreement they have with Commonwealth Sport to do so. They are doing one. Now, they're doing one that has been run by Bulb, a consultancy, and the University of the West of Scotland. Now, I asked the question today because Bulb is owned by Trivandi, which itself admits to saying it's embedded within the organising committee. And one of the professors at the University of the West of Scotland who'll be doing it also sits on the board of Team Scotland. So I did ask Phil that question today. That, to me, feels like you're marking your own homework. You are controlling the messaging of how successful the event was. And I would ask the broader question of, what value is that? I understand, why you want to do that. But then what value is that to future hosts? What value is that to Commonwealth Sport? He made the point that University of the West of Scotland research would be, independent and robust and all the rest of it. But that is going to control the messaging of how successful this was when that report comes out, which, again, they don't have to do this, but for somebody like yourself who just wants raw, unbiased data, that doesn't sit great with me. As I say, I would question what value is that to future hosts. They ran a procurement process. He says that Bulb was best placed in the procurement process and that it's in their interest to share the learnings of Glasgow 2026, which it is. But again, a small point or even a big point to take into consideration when we write in a few months' time the kind of legacy story of these games. But I'll return to the beginning. Yeah, I've got questions about it, and I still have questions about it in terms of how well it did commercially. But in terms of an event and how it was delivered, top class.
Excellent reporting as well, Martin. They're holding these people to account, as you say. It's needed. And good luck to India in 2030, because I think some of the struggles will be the same.
I must share this as a kind of any other business whimsical point, but Duncan Mackay of Zeus Files, you've met Duncan, his kind of questioning style in press conferences. He doesn't miss and hit the wall, as they say in Scotland. He asked the Gujarati sports head honcho, or council head honcho, in the press conference, the closing press conference. He said, and quite rightly, he said, we were promised in November when you were named hosts that there would be an organising committee. You said an organising committee would be formed within a month. When's it going to be formed? And he replied that it would be formed very quickly. And, we were more news in a few days. And he asked him why hadn't it been formed yet? And he was really shut down by the Gujarati official, which may be a nod to what might have to come in terms of the timeline, the schedule. The Commonwealth Sports say they're going to be very robust about monitoring it. Of course, this is all in the backdrop of Delhi and what happened, the budget overrun, the delays, different state council, different Indian government, but questions, those kind of questions I'm sure will remain. So I don't know what manana is in Gujarati, but that was the kind of vibe I was getting.
Yeah, I'm sure it's not going to be quite the deadlines they say they're going to be, but we will cover it nonetheless.
Anyway, John, what have you got for me before we sign off?
Just, a quick one. It's more of a newsroom thing really, but I think, a big move in the US this week with the new commissioner of Major League Soccer now announced, Larry Berg, co-owner of LAFC, who's going to start in January, replacing Don Garber, who's been there for a long time, 1999, I think, second longest serving commissioner of a US major league. Do you know who the longest serving is, Martin?
NHL, David Stern?
Correct. Gary Bettman. David Stern was NBA, but you got the sport right, and that's the main
Sorry.
thing.
That's what I meant. That's what I meant.
I wanted just to look at, it's a long look ahead, but obviously he's going to take charge in January, and there's a hell of a lot going on. He did a press conference where he said, the foundation has been built, and if you remember when Garber came in, it wasn't that long after, US had hosted the World Cup in 94, it was the start of MLS, it was a very different kind of property back then, and he said, all the great foundations are in place, it's all about using the catalyst of this World Cup and tweaking little things, and obviously they've got a move to a European calendar coming. They're not going to do the whatever is at the moment February through November. It's going to go to a usual July right through to May. So that's going to be interesting. How does that impact their transfer market? There's talk of changes to, or they call it roster management or squad building, if you like. How that happens. There's so many complicated rules in MLS around players you can buy and how you discover them, etc. So that's likely to change. But I think the interesting one for us is this new TV deal. So they tweaked the Apple deal, as we know, in terms of how you get it, but also the duration of the contract. It ends 29. So we haven't got long left. They're going to be looking at going to market probably quite soonish into his tenure. So, I think he's got a lot on his plate. There's some wild numbers being thrown around at how much MLS should be able to command for their rights. I'm not quite sure they're in line with what the market thinks, but interesting hire and plenty for him to do. So I thought it'd be worth mentioning on this week's pod, as it is a fresh appointment.
Is he bringing back halfway line penalty shootouts?
Oh, I hope so. And mad kits, yeah.
They still great, get traction on socials. People love that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just to sign off from my behalf would be, I don't know if you saw the clip on, I think it was TNS, the Welsh team, which have obviously returned to league action. And I don't know if this was an airport activation or an EasyJet activation. I think it was EasyJet. I'm sure we could post a clip below. It is, I presume it's meant to be horrendously tacky. It is the two teams coming out and a chap wearing a kind of fluorescent jacket with what do you call them when you're directing airplanes? Table tennis bats.
Yeah, that would do. Keep it sporty.
Yes, whiff waff bats. He's directing the two teams onto the pitch with these, and it just looks, it's like the bit out of Airplane when the guy's doing it at the movie. It's so far away from Benfica and Emirates and that kind of air stewards, hostesses activation of however many, 10, 12 years ago, whenever that was, very, rehearsed. This is very low budget. I don't know if it's meant to be. I think they're poking fun at themselves, perhaps. It's worth a lookout for a cheap and cheerful activation.
It is, yeah. It might be a sport business sponsorship activation study down the line.
It wouldn't take long.
Excellent. Well, Martin, thank you as always for your time. And for those listeners, we will be back next week with another podcast. And as always, for all the most accurate rights feeds across media and sponsorship and the latest breaking news across the global sports industry, head to sportbusiness.com, and we'll be back another time.